Thank you, Tamar. Good evening, morning, or afternoon, wherever you may be, and shalom from Jerusalem. After looking at the traditional attachment of Jews from the Middle East, North Africa and Sephardic Jews to the land of Israel, their actual aliya to the land and strategies for travel in the first lecture, then in lecture 2, their actual settlement in the land and manifestations of ethnic identity in social space and physical place. In lecture 3, I return to those topics with a special focus on women. After reviewing the questions on chat, I'd like to give a more comprehensive answer to Carol, who asked about the motivations of women to make aliyah. Some of the same characteristics will come up today when looking at the Zionist activity in late Ottoman Palestine, private aspirations and considerations versus larger ideologies, and ideologically motivated pull factors of aliyah versus the push factors of economic and political crises and personal safety. Traditional women's aliyah seems to have been motivated by the larger ideology of a love of Zion and attachment to the land, as was men's aliyah. But for women, this seems to have been a more personal attachment, an internalized desire, rather than a commandment, the result of study or encouragement by rabbis. For both, of course, a trigger was needed at a specific time. I have found that economic and political turmoil has been had much less influence on women than for men, for whom there was a clear correlation between physical and material havoc and aliyah. For women, this was generally related to family status, children establishing their own families, widowhood, or other circumstances. In today's lecture, we will look at Sephardi and MENA, the acronym for Middle East and North African Jews in Palestine, in the last 3 decades of Ottoman rule, prior to World War I, and their part in the developing landscape in evolving society as redefined by the organized ideological Zionists from Europe. The focus, as such, is a quite politicized subject of historical narratives. And in the following then, as well as in the following decades and century, and today with underlying tensions at times still erupting, as in the Knesset and Israeli media just 2 weeks ago until it was taken over by the news of the war in the Ukraine. As such, the second half of my talk on historiography and historical narratives will relate to some of your questions and comments. Why didn't we know about this? And that goes beyond academia. At the end, of course, questions which you may type into the chat for tomorrow. In contrast to prior talks, I will be using the term Sephardim colloquially as an umbrella term and shorthand for all MENA Jews, and not more definitively as technically Sephardi or not, whether under the aegis of the Sephardic Council or not. In this context, I include all who are not Ashkenazi. To begin, the Sephardim in the Zionist Yeshuv or Sephardim and the Zionist Yeshuv. Yeshuv being the centuries-old Hebrew term for the Jewish communities in Eretz Israel. I will open with a story relayed some 50 years after its occurrence in the summer of 1882, when Yosef Eliyahu Shlush, the then 12-year-old son of Aaron Shlush of Jaffa and later of Neve Tzedek, about whom I spoke in lecture 2, met Russian and Romanian Zionists in Jaffa for the first time. Yosef Eliyahu recalled, here my translation with some deletions, I remember when they arrived, we were at the prayer house. It was strange at the beginning. They remained standing and stared at the congregation. Afterwards, several of them approached the ark and kissed it and looked at the writing on the covering. But in spite of this, the members of the congregation looked at them with suspicion, thinking they were English missionaries who came to hunt for our souls, and only for the sake of appearance honored our holy ark. When prayers ended, the members of the delegation presented themselves to my father. Immediately, my father rose from his seat and together with several of the leaders, left with the guests for our home. Chairs and a table were brought to the large porch, and coffee and sweets were arranged in the best manner of hospitality. My father was exceedingly happy when he spoke with these Chovevei Tzion pioneers for several hours and realized that this was indeed an honored delegation of Jews from Russia who came to tour the land in order to purchase land and settle. My late father responded joyfully to their request to assist them. Without another thought, he happily offered them 2 large rooms with a porch for their use as offices. The guests thanked him sincerely, and one of them offered a goodly sum. But my father refused, insisting, "I support your dedicated movement for the revival of the Jewish settlement in Eretz Yisrael." Chovevei Tzion, literally the lovers of Zion in Hebrew, were members of local organizations founded in the early 1880s in Russia and Eastern Europe, many in response to the anti-Jewish pogroms in the Russian Empire in 1881. These organizations are now considered the forerunners and foundation builders of modern Zionism, a political movement founded later by Herzl at the First Zionist Congress in 1897. Many of the first groups were established with the aim to promote Jewish migration to Palestine, and this at a time of mass migration to the United States, and secondly, to advance Jewish settlement there, particularly in agriculture. These Chovevei Tzion who came to Jaffa continued to operate from Shlush's home for the next 3 months, its representatives enjoying not only office space, but the family's hospitality on Shabbat and holidays. Whether the incident I cited is a verbatim report of the conversation or Yosef Eliyahu's account colored by later Zionist rhetoric does not change the basic facts. His father, Aaron Shlush, a North African Jew living in Jaffa since the 1840s, most certainly had knowledge of Chovevei Tzion's activities prior to this meeting. He immediately embraced the new Zionist activity, and his family became personally involved in it. Strange impressions and suspicions rose in the Russian Zionist camp as well as among Jaffa's Sephardic community. Zalman Pukashevsky, one of 6 young men sent from Russia by Chovevei Tzion in 1885 to specialize in agriculture in the settlements supported by Baron Edmond de Rothschild, a French member of the famous banking family and a great supporter of Zionism. Pukashevsky portrayed his disbelief of the other in an initial meeting with Avram Moyal, a contemporary of Shlush and head of the Chovevei Tzion office in Jaffa. Again, my translation with deletions. From outside the house, it was no different from other houses in the neighborhood. However, upon going up the stairs, we immediately felt there was the beauty and the ease of the East. We went up carpeted stairs to a large hall, well lit through colored glass, with a sparkling white marble floor opposite the sun's rays. Upon hearing us, Eliezer Okach, the secretary of Chovevei Tzion, took us to another hall, this one larger and furnished in Oriental style, strange and foreign to us, making a strong impression on us with its novelty. In the far corner of this sat a man cross-legged on the floor, reclining on richly embroidered pillows. On his head was a dark red tarbush with a black silk tassel dangling from it. He was smoking thoughtfully from a long pipe threaded with silver and crimson strands. And here Pukashevsky continues on and on about the nargila smoking. In my eyes, he concludes, it seemed as if some Ottoman pasha was sitting in front of me. In spite of Moyal's official position in the Chovevei Tzion office, Pukashevsky and his companions preferred meeting in the shop of Shlomo Grossman, an Ashkenazi Jew in the town, and their unofficial club was established there. The Abu family in Tzfat is another example among many who not only bought land near Tzfat and Meron, but also assisted those Zionist Chalutzim, pioneers, in establishing the first Moshevot, or agricultural settlements, in the Upper Galilee, intervening with Ottoman officials on behalf of Rosh Pina, acquiring land to establish Yesoda Ma'ala in 1883, as well as assisting those in Shoshanat HaYarden, Bnei Yehuda, and more. Shlush, Moyal, Abu, and the vast majority of North African and Middle Eastern Jews and Sephardim in Palestine identified with Zionist aspirations in general and participated in the endeavors throughout the country, although conventional Zionist historiography has, by and large, marginalized them or ignored them altogether. In the new Moshevim and Kibbutzim established by the European groups, the gold standard for Zionist activity in Eretz Israel, a very small percentage of the Sephardim lived. The World War I period census, Sfirat Yehudei Eretz Israel, accounting of the Jews in Eretz Israel, lists the numbers of settlers in each locale, as well as in the cities, but in analyzing the demographics, one must take into account the devastation caused by war, the expulsion of many Jews from the country, particularly Ashkenazim, with foreign protection, and high mortality. However, the population tables by ethnic identification do afford a general picture. Nearly 50 agricultural settlements are listed, with some 15,000 individuals, of whom 2/3 lived in the 19 Moshevot in what is referred to as Judea, including Petach Tikva, Rishon LeZion, and Rehovot, now all bustling cities. Others were in the Upper and Lower Galilee and in the general area of Haifa. Excuse me? Okay. At the most, 20% of the settlers were non-Ashkenazim, half of them Yemenite, but most Moshevot had no or only a few non-Ashkenazim, and this at a time when just under half of the Jews in the country were Sephardim, North Africa, and Middle Eastern Jews. It is not that the Sephardim were averse to agricultural communal life on the Moshevot, but it seems that it was due to the fact that these settlements were formed by Zionist groups based in Europe, and they continued their tight social networking long after making aliya, making an exception for their Yemenite laborers. And as exemplified by Yosef Eliyahu Shlush's memoir, in the 1880s, they enthusiastically assisted European Zionists in their efforts to establish these new agricultural Zionists. Prior to European Zionist activities, many Sephardim had participated in initiatives to establish agricultural settlements and in productive activity, using later Zionist jargon. Community leaders took a progressive view towards schooling. In 1855, Jaffa and Jerusalem leaders requested Montefiore's assistance in establishing a girls' school, or at least obtaining a teacher for them, even if it was in response to efforts of missionaries in the city to lure girls to their schools. They supported the agricultural schools established in Mikveh Yisrael near Jaffa in 1870 by French-Jewish Alliance Israelite Universelle, or in short, Alliance, or in Hebrew, Kiach, as well as general education and formal vocational training. The extensive public and private involvement of Sephardim in the Zionist enterprise, both economic and social, were generally not acknowledged by Zionist organizational frameworks and social networks formed in Eastern and Central Europe and transplanted to Eretz Israel, and certainly not by those socialist, secular circles of the so-called second and later third aliyot. The Sephardim were marginalized even by contemporary European Zionists, according to their concept of who was in and who was out, irrelevant of actions. Ultimately, their activities were eclipsed by Ashkenazi European hegemony and subsequent Zionist narratives. In still other cases, Sephardi initiatives in late Ottoman Palestine have been co-opted into Zionist narratives. One example we have seen is that of the expanding Jewish residential areas outside in Jerusalem. The expansion of the Jewish quarter within the walls has been considered traditional, and that outside the walls as modern, even at times erroneously described as motivated by national ideologies, where in fact it was one process. Shaul Yechezkel Yuda, a Baghdadi Jew in Jerusalem, also bought land, but further outside Jerusalem from the Arab village of Colonia, together with his brother-in-law, Yoshua Yelin, another example of intermarriage noted last week. And attempts were made by various Sephardim to settle there. Later, Sephardim and Ashkenazim established the settlement of Mosa, which we can see today off the main highway. A prime example of a co-opted narrative is that of Yemeni immigration. Lebe Tamar, literally, let me climb the palm, Tamar in Hebrew, from the Song of Songs, which is an acronym for the Hebrew year Taf Resh Mem Bet, 1881 to 1882. The reasons for this wave of immigration are not clear, but no doubt the culmination of century-old traditional love of Zion meshing with a rather sudden change in Ottoman policy, allowing Jews to leave the country. Due to the year 1882, they entered the Zionist narrative of the first aliya. However, in fact, the first Yemenite Olim arrived in 1881, months before the arrival of the first Chovevei Tzion, and not with the nationalist ideology of European Zionists. Not only that, but while the several hundred Yemenites arrived that year, in contrast to only tens, not only that, but while several hundreds of Yemenite Jews arrived that year, in contrast to only tens of Jews who arrived in Eretz Yisrael from Russia. Those Chalutzim saw the Yemenite as natural agricultural workers of the East, as were the local Arabs, and hired them as manual laborers, in spite of the fact that most had been artisans and merchants from the capital city of Sana'a in Yemen. As such, not only their arrival in the country, but also their work was co-opted into the Zionist goal of productivity. All this requires a brief discussion of Zionist perceptions, that is to say, European Zionist perceptions, value judgments, and ideological and social connotations vis-a-vis the Yeshuv. The Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael at the time, drawing a new map of the country with new pictures of its inhabitants. They divided the Jews into the old Yeshuv, those religious Jews living in the traditional holy cities who came to pray, study, and die in the Holy Land, living only on charity, and their new productive Jews, those who immigrated to the land in order to build a land imbued with nationalist ideologies and supporting themselves on work, preferably in the agricultural settlements, in the green areas here on the map. Zionist historiography was first and foremost European and Ashkenazi, and still is to a certain extent. Ideological polemics have been argued within the context of European Jewish history and Haskalah Enlightenment values. Neither definition of old or new Yeshuv encompasses the realities of the continuum of activity and ideology between the two poles. I parenthetically add that, as previously noted, the new, the old, and the Sephardi Yeshuv were almost totally composed of immigrants and their children, so the old and new are sociological terms relating to Zionist perceptions of their behavior and values, and not to the time that they had been in Palestine. Many of the old Yeshuv, for example, worked and supported their own families. Many in the new Yeshuv relied on outside support and donations to eke by. Most in the old Yeshuv immigrated out of clear ideological reasons, even if traditional and not new. Many in the new Yishuv immigrated due to economic and political havoc in their former towns and cities. The polemics related to Ashkenazi Jews, whom the Zionists saw or included or rejected. They did not see the Sephardim or acknowledge alternative positions. In 1977, Yisrael Bartal published a seminal article, Old and New Yishuv, Image and Reality, noting that this so-called rift, quote, reflects only parts of the Jewish community as it really was and leaves a broad spectrum of social, economic, and cultural phenomena unaccounted for, unquote. In short, we are worth mentioning, but not the other. So, where are the Sephardim? In short, they're not there. In the 1980s and 1990s, much ink was spilled, as they say, on the subject of the old and new Yishuv, noting the problematics of the term and the realities between the extremities. But few mentioned the Sephardim and their absence from the discussion. Yaakov Barnai, in his work on historiography and nationalism, was an exception and did ask, and he brought them into the discussion, as did Yisrael Bartal. At the same time that the images and realities of the old and new Yishuv were being challenged, much new research was being carried out on the Sephardic, Yemenite, Bukharan, Persian, and North African communities in late Ottoman Palestine, adding a significant input into the mosaic of the Yishuv. The resulting composite picture was further analyzed in the last quarter of the decade as scholars began to grapple with the dissonance between the Zionist narratives of the Yishuv vis-a-vis Sephardic activities in the Yishuv. I might add that parallel developments occurred in the study of Zionism in Islamic lands, but that is beyond this lecture. For the Sephardim, the ideology of Zionism was a natural continuation and extension of their traditional love of Zion and their activist position regarding aliya, labor in the land, and financial independence. The rabbinic leaders, as well as the laymen of these communities, embraced Zionism and envisioned no conflict between Zionism and their religious interests, economic activities, or communal organizations. As such, most MENA Jews in Palestine continued their traditional way of life in family and synagogue while meshing Zionist ideas and processes of modernity into it. They pragmatically adopted and adapted the modern methods of commerce and business opportunities, as well as Western education. Can you please show the next? Good, thank you. As well as Western education, integrating new goals into the communal organizations, including Zionist initiatives. I contend that one must speak about three general categories, or maybe even more, each with a broad spectrum of daily praxis, lived experiences, identities, and ideologies. The old Ashkenazi Yishuv, the new Zionist Yishuv, and the Sephardi Yishuv, not as an intermediate or compromising position, but as another alternative option. It should also be noted that the stance of Jerusalem's Sephardic elite differed from that of other MENA Jews in the country, especially during the interwar British Mandate period, and that it was a defensive stand as a veteran organization fighting to maintain its former glory and authority, and as individuals struggling to maintain their status while simultaneously adopting and adapting modern patterns of behavior. In spite of their marginalization, the Sephardim were deeply involved in the evolving economy of the country and the expanding boundaries of Jewish settlement. In the 1920 obituary of Aaron Shlush, he was extolled as, quote, one of the Chovevei Tzion, the lovers of Zion, in the broadest and truest sense of the term, unquote. In 1931, his son, Yosef Eliyahu Shlush, cynically noted the discrepancy between the dominant Zionist practice and his own status. Again, in my own free translation with omissions, quote, "In my nativity, I thought that as a native of Jaffa and now Tel Aviv, and years in which I joined the many efforts in both cities, I thought that the words Jewish Zionists, which rang in my ears, were those whose purpose was to settle the land. Over time, I began to understand differently. Who were the true Zionists? Those Jews, Edot Mizrach, Eastern Jews, who came to the land of their own free will, out of a true love of Zion. They weren't Zionists. I was wrong. In the eyes of the radical Zionists, only those who came from Russia and those who were not religious, they were the Zionists," unquote. Throughout the years, Sephardim continued to try to prove their Zionist credentials. I argue that such examples of being in actually showed how much the Sephardim were in fact out, socially, organizationally, and often physically, as graphically shown by the map, which I discussed in Lecture 2 of Neve Tzedek, the first Jewish neighborhood outside Jaffa city boundaries, with the Shlush homes, synagogue, and factory, and Chaim Amzaleg's spacious home and lush gardens, adjacent to, but not within, the lot of some 40 crowded apartments of the Ashkenazi. Although active in the formation of the neighborhood, they remained on the fringes of the community, both physically and socially. They lived together with the Ashkenazim, but not among them. Until relatively recently, few challenged Zionist terminology and historical paradigms which perforce excluded Sephardim, North African, and Middle Eastern Jews, and settled for uncovering more and more examples of Sephardi involvement in the Zionist Yishuv. Yitzhak Bezalel, in his groundbreaking book entitled You Were Born Zionists, the Sephardim and the Hebrew Revival during the Ottoman period, began to grapple with this problem and paved the way for a more nuanced discourse. By broadening the chronological, demographic, and social foundations of the evolving Yishuv and the development of its social climate and communal institutions, its non-European, non-Ashkenazi players are included, and not just suffered. New works on the various Middle Eastern Jewish communities in late Ottoman period, the British Mandate period from the end of World War I until 1948, and the early years of the state challenged the accepted periodization. For example, the pogroms and revolutions in Eastern Europe, which sparred the Zionist aliya, as it did mass migration to the United States, had no effect on the timing of immigration from Islamic lands. It is then European Jewish history, ideology, and settlement in Palestine, which Zionist historiography used to define the quote, unquote, first, second, and third, etc. aliyot, ignoring different possibilities for different time periods for different people, for different groups. Likewise, the demographics are judged by their value in Zionist eyes, not necessarily anchored in the realities of the country. We read extensively on the tens of pioneering chalutzim of the so-called First Aliyah Bilu group, but only nothing of the hundreds arriving monthly from North Africa, Yemen, Bukhara, and the Middle East. The social foundations of the Yishuv are being re-examined and recognizing private as well as collective initiatives outside the official Zionist organizational frameworks and social networks formed in Eastern and Central Europe and transplanted to Eretz Yisrael, not in opposition to those developments, but complementing them. This is particularly true of the integral role of private enterprise, ignored by those of the dominating socialist second and third aliyot. Yosef Eliyahu Shlush, again for example, founded a company named Karkaot, Lands, in 1912, to buy, or as later reported, to redeem urban and agricultural lands throughout the country, and later sold the company without a profit to the Zionist Palestine Land Development Company, Chevrat Hachsharat HaYeshuv. Personal initiatives and the transitional position of MENA Jews in the evolving economy and developing local society made their contributions unique, bridging traditional and modern national societies, ideologies, and economies. In communal affairs as well in business, the Shlush, Abu, El Maliach, Valero, Kukia, and many other families from Jaffa and Jerusalem, Tiberias and Haifa, used their good personal relations with the Arabs to try and lessen anti-Zionist activity, especially during World War I. Familiarity and respect for all groups, moderate attitudes in religious issues, typical of 19th century MENA Jews, their knowledge of Arabic and understanding of Arab ways, as well as their pragmatic adaptation of new ideas and methods in both communal affairs and commercial ventures, all facilitated their roles as early initiators, as well as middlemen in the transition of a traditional community into a modern Western society, and made them particularly effective in finding solutions to conflicts arising between the groups, be they Arab or Jewish, Ashkenazi, Sephardim, religious or secular. However, these are not the values extolled in Zionist narratives and are absent from Zionist historiography. Sephardic participation in Zionist affairs was eclipsed by the growing Ashkenazi European hegemony in Eretz Yisrael and ultimately forgotten until recently, and except by the family. Books, pamphlets, family projects, and tour guides have spread the lore. The Shlush family has been particularly prolific in its contributions, as you have heard in these lectures. New editions of Yosef Eliyahu's memoirs, The Story of My Life, Parashat Chayai, first published in 1931, have been published. An appropriately named family biography, Mijalabiya Lakova Tembel, from a jalabiya, the traditional dress in the Maghreb and Palestine, to a kova tembel, an Israeli cloth hat made symbolic as a sabra by the caricaturist Ephraim Kishon, and autobiographies by fourth generation Shlomo Shlush, In the Shadow of a Mission, and Julia Shlush, A Tree and Its Roots. Throughout the decades, large family gatherings have been organized, and additional booklets and now videos were published. 2 years ago, I was privileged to attend a large virtual gathering due to the pandemic on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the death of the family patriarch, Aaron Shlush, and new findings on the family's history were presented. All these present a rich, however problematic, treasure chest. Much of these works have been retroactively colored by Zionist rhetoric, using, for example, the new old term redeeming the land, geulata adamot, when describing land acquisitions. A conscious or subconscious rejection of total assimilation into an Ashkenazi secular Zionist society, emphasizing socialist ideals, together with their outsider status, eventually stymied their activities and minimalized their ability to act in the Zionist arena. In fact, all the various Shlush memoirs emphasized their rejection of socialism, and because of that, their own social rejection during their youth. So, who and what composed the Yeshuv? A critical analysis of the activities and position of Sephardim vis-a-vis the Zionist enterprise in general, and within non-formal and non-establishment Zionist activities, many of them private initiatives, is underway. New sources are being uncovered and multidisciplinary methodologies utilized. Most significantly, new analytical paradigms are being created to rethink and reform the history of the Yeshuv. Exciting new research, spurred by the pioneering work of Tel Aviv University's Professor Yaron Tzur and others, is being undertaken by the younger generation of scholars. New criteria for periodization are being suggested, and particularly multiple paradigms for modernization, locating or relocating Eretz Israel in its Middle Eastern context and not forcing them into European models of Jewish emancipation, modernization, and acculturation. The pervasive influence of European and colonial hierarchical Orientalist thinking in Zionist ideology, historiography, and praxis has surfaced. Orientalism here refers to the Orient, the East, as juxtaposed to the Occident, the West. 19th and 20th century Oriental studies in the West covered the languages, religions, philosophies, histories, etc. of Asian societies, especially ancient ones. As Jewish studies gained popularity, they were included in the field of Oriental studies, which came to encompass the Middle East. Western literature and art began to imitate and depict aspects of Orientalism in the Eastern world, often romantically. Jewish scholars of the Enlightenment saw the golden age of Jews in Spain under Muslim rule as a pinnacle of creativity and coexistence before its demise. Since the publication of Edward Said's Orientalism, in a book by the name Orientalism in 1978, the term has been used to refer to a patronizing Western attitude toward Middle Eastern, Asian, and North African societies, the ultimate other, depicting them as static and undeveloped versus Western society, developed, rational, flexible, and superior. Orientalism then was a tool of colonial power to suppress the other. The concept of Orientalism has been argued, supported, and rejected as a body of fact, opinion, and prejudice accumulated by Western European scholars. European Zionists absorbed these romantic visions and spoke of a revival of the East, for example, but they also adopted accompanying value judgments and rejected the East and the conscious and subconscious marginalization of the Oriental Jews from centers of power, from activities, and from history. And what are the implications of all this for today? These developments in Zionist and Israeli historiography are not academic alone. They have developed side by side with social and political changes in the country. The questions, the struggles, and the politics of who is in and who is out, who is a real Zionist, continue. Ethnic tensions, accusations, and demands for equal access to resources continue in Israel's society, privately and in public. Israeli institutions had, or according to some still, internalized the decades-old Orientalist perceptions and images as expressed by Zalman Puchachevsky in 1885, which I cited at the beginning of my talk. And the Sephardim, both veteran citizens and new immigrants, expressed the same feelings as those as Yosef Eliyahu Shlush in 1931, challenging the definitions of a Zionist state. I cannot now give a survey of demographic, social, and institutional changes in the Yishuv during the pre-state mandatory period, nor the impact of prior Zionist apparatus on the formation of the State of Israel's government, nor the impact of the ingathering of the exiles, the surge of new immigrants from East and West, Europe, Asia, and Africa, tripling the country's Jewish population of the new State of Israel within a few years and changing its composition. But I would like to bring a few brief examples how Orientalistic thinking molded social perceptions and influenced institutional action. Look at these two pictures. Where is your eyes drawn? To the modern Western dressed, or modern at least from the 1950s, or to the traditional Oriental other. The Zionist and Jewish aid organizations that were instrumental in establishing the State of Israel produced films depicting the rebuilding of the Jewish national home as a way to raise funds and support for the new beleaguered state. Consciously or not, they reinforced Orientalist discourse in Zionist discourse and Western cultural superiority. One example is this widely dispersed film created probably in the late 1950s, early 1960s by the UJA, the United Jewish Appeal, an American umbrella organization to collect funds for Jewish causes and promoting Israel, and the JDC, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, established in 1914 to aid Jews worldwide, and the Jewish Agency, the World Zionist Organization's operative branch for immigration and integration of new immigrants and education. The title of the film, 10 Days and 500 Years, already sets the tone for the juxtaposition of the stereotyped Oriental downtrodden traditional way of life of Jews in Muslim countries and the new superior modern life in the State of Israel. Here we can see an opening scene.
You don't know Abraham Danan or his family, but you know who they are. You've never met the Suisas, but you recognize this moment. The remnant returning from a far country, coming through the gates that are always open, day and night, as it was prophesied. Now they are home. Now if they build houses, they shall inhabit them. If they plant, they shall eat the fruits. You recognize this moment. You've seen it before and shared it. You made it.
Okay, so that was one view of the remnants of the Jewish people. And here another showing the miracle of Israel and modern society. Whoops, excuse me. Go back. Sorry. Here.
To understand the wonder of a faucet for Helen, you have to go back only 10 days. 10 days and 500 years. In Helen's village, water was this stream, the only water. The village was here because the water was here. You came here to drink it, and you came to get it for cooking. But only the women did. No man would lower himself to do women's work. Water was life.
Okay, the marginalization of Jews from North Africa and the Middle East continued. And they were expected to be absorbed in Israel, that is, absorbed into secular Western society, acculturating into a Zionist past, present, and future molded by the European Enlightenment values and Western culture, abandoning their own heritage. As an educator, I would like to bring a few final examples of the use of historical narratives and the changes in them in the field of education, leaving politics and social action to others. The imbalance in the Jewish and historical narrative first came to my attention over 45 years ago, 6 years after immigrating to Israel, when I was teaching a required course for matriculation in an Israeli public high school in Dimona, a town in southern Israel, one of the development towns created in the 1950s for settling new immigrants. The first residents were from North Africa, later joined by Yemenite Jews and Bnei Israel from India and others. The course I taught was called The History of the Jews in the Last Generations, with the creation of the State of Israel at its core. The syllabus was dictated by the Ministry of Education. The pupils studied the various topics from a government-approved book, including some 3 chapters on the Jews in Russia and Eastern Europe, chapters on the Jews of Germany and Western Europe, as well as their activities in chapters on Jewish communal organization, Jewish aid, philanthropy, and anti-Semitism. And in addition, 2 more chapters on American Jewry, and 4 pages on all of the African and Asian countries. The summary of that chapter noted that there were no conditions for development in Islamic countries due to the oppression and poverty, and accordingly, they played no active role in Jewish history, in Jewish social movements, or in the national revival of the Jews. And that with not one Ashkenazi Jew in my class. How could one expect them to connect to a history in which their families didn't exist? So I initiated student-based projects on family history, enriching their knowledge, and especially my knowledge, on the communities of Jews from Islamic lands, as well as from India, as those currently, and their history and the story of their aliya to Israel. And I returned to graduate school. Without going into the political and social turmoil in Israel in the 1970s, and whether demographically or politically correct or expedient, the situation demanded action. Teachers are agents of social values and national identity, but by the 1970s, the old secular socialist Zionist values were being questioned, and the state of Israel was maturing to the extent that it could and had to publicly acknowledge multiple identities of its citizens. About a year prior to teaching this class, the Ministry of Education created a new department, המרכז לשילוב מורשת ספרד והמזרח בחינוך ותרבות, the Center for the Integration of Sephardic and Oriental Jewish Heritage in Education and Culture, initiating teacher seminars, creating teaching materials, supporting academic research as a basis for development, as well as cultural works in literature, music, and theater. Slowly, not only was knowledge enlarged, but a social and educational consciousness of diversity and values was encouraged. At the first stage of this, in my opinion, just a little spice, and hot spices at that, were added to the existing syllabus, with piquant stories and nuggets of information. A bit of show and tell, as these patches on the program did not really stick. Slowly, in the decades since, and several generations of textbooks later, the integration tutored in 1975 is beginning to show results, but not without special government-sponsored committees every 15 or 20 years to investigate the failures and discrepancies, and not without political demands to rectify the situation. History was a prime target, but not the only one. What should be taught and how? The gaps are still wide, the arguments often bitter, but the necessity for change has been acknowledged and begun, if not completed. Pupils now learn about the histories of Jews in different regions, the impact of colonialization on Jewish communities, migration, including aliyah's responses to varying situations and opportunities for change. And I, as an educator, must be optimistic. In conclusion, or perhaps I have just opened a whole new can of worms, with the urban renewal and gentrification of Jaffa and Neve Tzedek, and within the contemporary political atmosphere of the country, North African Jews figure prominently in the retelling of local history. Here, on a wall of the painted tiles outside the Susan Dalal Arts Complex, built in Tel Aviv, Jaffa in 1989, in the refunctioned yet preserved Alliance and Chovevei Zion school buildings, one can clearly identify Aron Shlush and Chaim Amzalag, along with Ashkenazi leaders Shimon Rokach and Zerach Barnett. And in between Neve Tzedek's Chovevei Zion School for Girls and the building of the new Tel Aviv from sand dunes, the bridge connecting the new neighborhood of Neve Tzedek with the commercial center in Old Jaffa, creating a vital route between the two, erected to acknowledge Shlush's contribution to the 1892 train line laid from Jaffa to Jerusalem. Have the Sephardim been integrated into new Zionist narratives, or is this simply politically expedient or an academic exercise? The part of Sephardim, North African, and Middle Eastern Jews and in the Zionist Yishuv is complex, beginning with late Ottoman Palestine in the 1880s. For those from Marrakesh in Morocco to Zakko in Kurdistan, Zionism did not present a break with their traditions, but was an extension of them. While generally not accepting secular socialist principles as set out by later Zionist aliyot, the leaders, the rabbis, and the various community members, men and women, certainly identified and participated in collective initiatives, as well as private enterprise. Parenthetically, the role of the Ashkenazi private sector in the Zionist Yishuv, especially in the urban centers of the country, is also a relatively new theme in Zionist historiography, recognized but not extolled in past narratives, and ripe for the integration of Sephardi entrepreneurs as the Valero and the Amzalag families. The Sephardim represented a continuum between tradition and modernity, integrating the new and the old and feeling at home in both, adopting and adapting their lives as they see fit. Ever-changing historical narratives are now recognizing the limitations of using terms as the old and the new Yishuv, and placing Sephardim firmly on the soil of Eretz Yisrael and the state of Israel. But the wheels of historical narratives move slowly and are not in tandem with the social pressures and political tensions. The need for appropriate terminology is continuous. What is pejorative or descriptive, stereotyped or accepted, is constantly changing on the streets and in academia, and has been obvious throughout my talks. Orientalism may seem like a theoretical concept, a philosophical splitting of hairs, but its colonial hierarchical implications are very real, especially if one is pigeonholed and marginalized by it. The past is still with us, and its story is still evolving. Thank you for participating. Thank you, Tamar, and many thanks to the efficient and friendly production staff, to Kathy, and especially to Udi and Adam here in the studio with me all along.
Thank you very much, Michal, for showing us this maybe unknown part of Israeli Jewish demography in the years before Israel, and also this has a definite impact on life in Israel also today. Kevin would like to know, why are we not talking about Ben-Gurion, who did not want Arab Jews in the new state?
I tried not to go into politics too much, and I was trying to show my focus being on late Ottoman Palestine as the whole series, and I just want to show how things started in the 1880s Zionism and how they carried up. And I didn't use that as an example. I used Zionist information or propaganda as an alternate example.
Okay, I'm also going to say that I don't know if there's any other questions coming up, but for anyone who missed a previous sessions in the series, they're all on our website, so you can make up if you missed anything. Yes, Kevin is responding to you that it's a very political issue. Definitely, maybe we'll deal in some of these issues in our future series.
I might add also that there was a tension between the ideology of having an ingathering of the exiles, of open immigration, as opposed to the British limitations that were placed during the Mandate period, and the thought of who do we want to have, how many. So it's essentially a political question, a very political question, but it's alongside the question of allocating resources, which in the bottom line is also political.